And joining us now in studio, Avi Go, lawyer and director with the Chinese Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. Randall Hansen, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Quam McKenzie, psychiatrist and director of health equity at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH. And Jeffrey Reitz, professor and ethnic immigration studies at the University of Toronto. Great to have everybody around the table today for a discussion that will no doubt at various points be very politically incorrect, and that's just the way it should be. Speaking of which, remember this tape from 1995, the 30th of October, when Jacques Parizeau explained why the yes side lost the referendum? Let's roll tape. Reminder. Go ahead. Roll tape, Michael.
C'est vrai qu'on a été battu au fond par quoi? Par l'argent puis des votes ethniques, essentiellement.
We lost because of money and the ethnic vote, and that may have been the most sort of significant red-letter date in Canadian history when people, certainly in that moment, disparagingly looked at the ethnic vote as something that needed to be looked at differently or that somehow wasn't as Canadian as the rest of the votes. And I guess we want to start with this. Avi, does it exist? Is there a so-called ethnic vote in this country?
Well, I think in the mind of some of the politicians, certainly Mr. Jason Kenney thought that it existed, and that's why we saw the leaked memo about how to get the very ethnic votes.
Remind everybody what that memo said.
Well, I guess the Conservatives has a strategy of how to try to woo some of the votes from the various ethnic communities, and particularly in some of the ridings where there's a large percentage of South Asian and Chinese. So I guess in their mind, ethnics, first of all, is defined primarily as people of color, and who may or may not have been born in Canada or have been here for generations. We're not talking about Scottish or Irish or Francophones by any means. But I think that the Conservatives are not the first party who does that, but I think they certainly take it to a different level in a much more aggressive way, and I would say in some instances in a quite disrespectful way.
Now let's establish off the top that of all the people sitting around this table, you actually can't vote.
I can't vote.
You're not a citizen yet.
No.
But do you, as you look, you've been here long enough, obviously, to look around and follow the political atmosphere. Do you think there's an ethnic vote in this country?
I think there's an ethnic vote as much as there is a women's vote, or there's an older vote, or there's a younger vote. People have complex cultures and complex personalities, and their ethnicity is part of that. So is there an ethnic vote per se? There are certainly issues that are more likely to be important to ethnic minorities, such as what's happening in the urban environment, such as transportation, and such as some of the immigration policy issues that have come up. But people are more complex than that. There's not a single ethnic vote, I wouldn't have thought so.
But, go ahead.
What I'll say, but consistently in this country and in the United Kingdom and in Germany, ethnic minorities vote disproportionately for certain parties and parties of the left. And so one should be careful with the language and certainly want to reject Parizeau's notion that one vote counts more than another. But is there an ethnic vote? Well, yes, there is, according to the data. And one other comment, the Conservatives have also targeted old Europeans. They've been very interested in how Ukrainian Canadians vote, hence some of the support for the museum in Winnipeg.
Right.
But that's right. But the question is whether that is due to the fact that there are a number of issues that are more likely to be important to a certain group.
Sure.
It's not necessarily that there's an ethnic vote per se, but there could be if there are certain issues that people are more likely to find important.
But Jeffrey, when Jacques Parizeau said it, whatever it was, 15 years ago, is it 15 years ago already?
Yeah,
15 years ago.
16
yeah,
years.
16 years.
My goodness, 16 years in October, right? I mean, he clearly didn't mean it as, you're different and equal from everybody else. He clearly meant it as you're different and substandard.
It was one of the issues in the whole debate was whether or not the ethnic minorities were included in Quebec society or not. And he was basically saying that they were not.
Right.
But he was certainly right that their vote was critical. Yeah. In fact, that was more of a solid block than ethnic groups normally are able to achieve. It was virtually 100% voted no. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about ethnic votes in this current campaign, we don't have anything close to 100%. In fact, if you look at the bloc, they're only getting less than half of the Quebec vote, and yet we think of that as an ethnic vote. And also, there should be a distinction, I think, and that's been made here, but it needs to be underlined. When the so-called ethnic vote is a vote based on loyalty, strictly loyalty, a sense that as a member of this ethnic group, I vote this way, that's the way it is, as opposed to a particular issue that is, that affects a minority group, and the vote is disproportionate in a certain ethnic group because of that issue.
And that's still the case.
Different kind of thing, and that happens.
That is
and I
still-
think that's what we're talking about actually when we're talking about conservatives seeking the immigrant vote. It's actually an issue-oriented approach that's being taken, not a sense of, because there's certainly no loyalty toward the Conservative Party among immigrant ethnic minorities.
Well, I don't know how many of you knew this here, but we do have we have a rock star at the table today, the star of a viral video. This thing's all over YouTube, kids. You got to see this thing. Okay, Avi, stand by. We're going to play a few seconds of this thing.
You were beating it, weren't you? You were beating it.
Yeah, here's look for Avi Go. I think you're off to the left there, geographically and politically. Okay, roll tape.
Ask you what you do around here. Don't wanna know your name or if you really care. See the truth behind the lies and reject the words of fear. So beat it, just beat it. You have a choice, you better speak when you can. Don't wanna be an ethnic Canadian. It's time to take a stand, get a ballot in your hand. So beat it. You want a fair and equal chance, so beat it, beat it.
I was thinking showbiz. You're actually on the right of the frame, but you're stage left. Anyway, that was you in the striped shirt on the right-hand side. Why'd you make this video?
Well, I guess, partly because of the leaked memo that we just mentioned, but also in response to some of the stories that came out afterwards. It seems that the media was more interested in talking about, well, does this ethnic vote, is the strategy going to work or it doesn't work, rather than trying to understand the underlying issues. So we want to kind of create a space for us to talk about the underlying issues, but at the same time, making fun of this whole very absurd notion of ethnic votes. And, and it kind of comes down to song and dance and food, so that's why we kind of do this song and dance and food at the same time.
Well, you say it's an absurd notion. Is it really that absurd? I mean, the parties are certainly
No, it's not.
treating it
I
that
mean,
way.
if there were no, I can understand why people are uncomfortable with the language, but if there were no ethnic vote, then you'd expect ethnic minorities or immigrants, and we need to distinguish those two categories, to look like everyone else in terms of their voting patterns, and we don't see that. What we see is, as I say, a disproportionate vote for left-wing parties. Now, when you look at this historically in Canada and break down the data by group, what you do see is that racial minorities, non-Europeans, still tend to vote disproportionately for the Liberal Party. Older immigrants, non-Anglo, non-French Europeans, tend to vote more for the Conservatives. I don't think that has anything to do with race. I think what it has to do is time in the country. The longer you are in Canada, the less you have what we might call an immigrant interest. But I agree, we should be talking about those interests, not about an ethnic vote.
Graham?
Sorry.
It'd be interesting to know because some of this, when I was preparing for this, I was reading some information about what was happening in the 50s and in the 60s. And in the 50s and the 60s, it did seem like the immigrant vote was a Conservative vote. And that changed round in the 60s. So, I mean, I think it depends. It's probably less to do with how long you've been in the country.
I wonder if that was because of John Diefenbaker. He was the first kind of non-French, non-English prime minister in the late 1950s, and therefore maybe more immigrants felt a kinship towards him.
It could have been that. It could have been that they're different sorts of people, people coming from different places. I mean, I don't know.
But wouldn't also have to do with the other factors, such as your socioeconomic factors, your religious background. So I think that, for instance, I think the Conservatives might be appealing more to a particular segment in the, let's say, the Chinese community, who are maybe more likely to go to church, or they're more well off. They don't see social safety net as important an issue. Therefore, a smaller government is better. So I think a lot of factors have to come into play, and I think that we want to, I guess, highlight through the video how absurd in the sense that they are just looking at one factor, ethnicity, and then also at the same time, like to think that we're just a whole bunch of people who are unthinking, who can be persuaded one way or another by, inviting us to some photo op with the prime minister. I mean, Chinese took 62 years in order to earn the right to vote, and I don't think the pioneers in our community wanted us to have that right today so that we can be somebody's photo op.
Got it. Jeffrey, you want to
Well,
add?
yeah, I agree with the idea we should be looking at the issues. And if you look at what conservatives are doing, they're appealing to immigrant groups on the basis of, I would say, social conservatism, which has to do with issues related to gay rights, law and order. Those are the kinds of things that they're going for, and they're actually succeeding to a degree with that. But what's interesting, I think, is that there's a conflict that they face because a lot of the traditional conservative supporters, who are socially conservative, are anti-immigrant. And they look at the immigrants actually as a threat to the traditional social
Strange
values.
bedfellows.
Now, it's ironic, and you'd think, well, these two groups ought to get together and talk, and if they did, it might clarify some issues.
Yeah, but
I think
very
that,
interesting to see them getting together and,
well, it'd be unlikely. That's what's happening. I mean, it's a kind of a comment on Canadian society that these two groups of people, that the Conservatives are both trying to appeal to on the same basis, are actually at odds with one another.
But the social conservatives aren't going anywhere. I mean, that's why
they
it
could
makes it
stay
a
home.
wise. They could stay home. They could stay home. I think that's doubtful when the expectation is at best a minority government. I expect turnout will be high. But they're certainly going to remain ideologically with the Conservative Party. So it makes perfect sense to take that as read and then look for votes elsewhere. And that's why the appeal to the, again, quote unquote, immigrant vote or ethnic minority vote is a very wise one.
Let me toss this into the mix as well. Michael, if you would, bottom of page 1, we'll bring up this graphic. One expert says the demographics should appreciate the attention they are receiving, since a lot of groups, Aboriginal people, the poor, those with disabilities, have gone relatively unmentioned during the election campaign. Here's a quote: "It gives you political power when people are focusing on you," said Alex Marlin, assistant professor at Memorial University who studies political marketing. They should be saying, listen to us, we matter, and these are the concerns we have, and we're glad you're paying attention. Avi, is that in fact the way you're taking it?
No, well, I guess we wanted our matters to matter, but I don't think that just because they're looking at the ethnic votes means that they are looking at our issues. And in fact, they are not, and that's why we're doing the video to highlight that there are many issues that we're faced with. Racialization of poverty, that the wage and income gaps between immigrants of color as well as second-generation Canadian-born visible minority versus white Canadians. We're concerned about immigration policy, and in fact, that's another contradiction. We have a conservative government who, at the same time saying that we want to vote the ethnic votes, but if you look at their platform for the last few years, they've been doing a number of things that really are contradictory to the interests of these groups.
that's not-
Go ahead, Jeff, and then
Absolutely,
Yeah,
though,
by all means.
and that illustrates that there is going to be a limit to how far the Conservatives will go in looking for the so-called ethnic vote, because the further they go, the more they're going to alienate some of the traditional base. At the same time, I think it's important to mention that not everyone in ethnic minority groups agrees on what the government should do for their ethnic group. There's a lot of, the ethnic vote is never 100%. The Liberals don't get 100%, never got 100%.
Randall?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I don't think the racialization of poverty is necessarily a Chinese or a Indo-Canadian interest, because they're doing extremely well economically. That might be a Caribbean
Not
interest.
According to the statistics, I can only tell you about the Toronto statistics. Chinese is still twice as likely to live in poverty than compared to someone who's white.
Second generation or first?
Well, it's by race as opposed to by whether or not they come to Canada as an immigrant. Like, we're talking, and whether it's United Way, poverty by postal code, or the Ornstein report, they all point to the fact that Chinese, South Asian, plus any other groups are doing poorly. Of course, the darker the color of your skin, the more likely you are to live in poverty.
Yeah, but what's also true is, no, I agree that for first generations there's a problem of racialized poverty. But, and I refer actually to Professor Wright's, Jeff's work on this, by the second generation, those gaps almost disappear, and that's very unique in Canada.
Again, not according to the stats. Like 2006 stats shows that if you're a person of color, male, you make about 75 cents compared to a white male. If you're a woman of color, you make about 56 cents compared to $1 that is made.
Let's get Quam in here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's true, and I totally agree with the statistics that I've seen support that there is a racialization of poverty and there's a racialization of unequal pay. I was sort of thinking about the question you asked about whether people should be happy that their issues or their colour is being noticed. And Yes, of course, people will be happy that they're being noticed. But the question is how you're noticed. You know, I mean, as you can see, we've all come today in our national costumes. You know, and
Suit and tie?
Yeah, well, that's
Suit and tie for-
you're,
well,
you're
suit
lucky,
anyway.
You're lucky I didn't have a bowler hat on. You know, we've come in national costumes, and the problem is it's the way you do it, and the fact that it's being done by a number of people so haphazardly. You know, people are coming late to the table and saying, now we really care about you, when clearly they don't.
Okay, well, tell me this, Quam. I mean, you're joking about the memo that the Conservatives put out because they said, you know, please invite some of your people and make them wear their native costumes and all of that, which clearly seemed pandering. But they got caught. We're not really here to say that the other parties don't pander as well, right?
Oh, I wasn't saying that it was just a Conservative issue. I think that people want you to come and talk about their issues rather than talk about necessarily their colour or their culture. That's what people are interested in. And I think that the reason why people didn't think that this was going to be a problem was probably because the representation inside the parties and the representation inside the power in the parties doesn't reflect people in Canada. And so people produce ridiculous memos because they don't know any better.
You've studied this for a long time. Do you think the political party's interest in so-called ethnic communities is, you know, pandering or trolling for votes, or it's because they have a genuine interest in seeing those communities do better?
Well, you know, it's a job of politicians to get people's vote, and so that's what we call democracy. So I don't see that as pandering, unless, of course, it's being done in a way that doesn't really respect the actual points of view of people that are affected.
And is that happening now?
Well, certainly this particular case reflected, I think, a view of ethnic minorities as kind of objects to be somehow manipulated, rather than as people who have issues on their minds. You know, that's definitely the case.
Let's get a better handle on the numbers here. Michael, if you would, we're going to go to the two graphics on page 2 after question 4, Canada's immigrants. And, you know, these numbers, let's admit off the top, they're from StatsCan, but they're 5 years old, and I'm sure they're somewhat different right now. But we'll bring these up just so you can get a sense about what kind of numbers we're talking about. Canada's immigrants. Okay, where are they from? Well, almost 1.7 million from Europe, a little over 500,000 from the UK, about 250,000 from the United States, 700,000 from the Caribbean and Latin America, Oceania, which is a term you don't hear very often, very small number, Australia, New Zealand, the islands around that area. Let's flip it over because here's, you know, what we're about to show you are the high growth areas, and certainly in the last 5 years have been. India and Southeast Asia, over 1 million, 750,000 from China, that includes Hong Kong and Taiwan. When you look at the rest of Asia, that's Japan, Pakistan, Korea, 344,000, Middle East, another 300,000 plus, and almost 400,000 from Africa. Okay, again, not quibbling over the numbers, which are, you know, reasonably in the neighborhood. Randall, what do you infer from the story that those numbers tell?
I'm not sure I have an answer for that question.
Do they reveal anything particular about where politicians are focusing their efforts?
Well, no, again, no. I mean, all I can come back to the point that if you have a situation in which you have a consistent pattern of ethnic minorities voting differently from the overall population averages, then it makes absolute sense that political parties would attempt to mobilize that vote. And the Liberals have done that for years, and indeed, everyone's being incredibly hard on the Conservatives over the memo, and I understand why. But the Liberal Party in this country is hardly innocent of folkloric multiculturalism. I mean, I grew up with Ukrainian dances in the 1970s. There's a long tradition in this country of associating the immigrant with a particular other form of dress or behavior.
But this is why I think the Conservatives are in sort of dangerous territory going here, because their traditional support actually is anti-immigrant, and the people who've been voting for the Conservative Party, and the image of the Conservative Party is to see immigrants as threatening traditional Canadian values.
But let me try this with you. That traditional base of the Conservative Party also wants the Conservative Party to win.
Exactly.
And they probably understand nowadays that if the Conservatives are going to win, given just what the lack of movement in the polls in the last 5 years, they need all the help they can get.
Sure, as long as they don't accommodate the views of those people with regard to things like citizenship tests and multiculturalism and so on, because those policies, which have not been particularly popular with the government, the current government, are very popular in these immigrant communities that they're trying to appeal to.
Avi, let me try this with you. I guess there's always a question about how much the direct request for support from various so-called ethnic groups will reflect itself in the foreign policy that the country ultimately takes. Now, the current government was pretty hostile to China for a good long time, and now we know, of course, that led by Jason Kenney, they have been looking into the Chinese community for a considerable amount of support. Do you think that support reflects itself in the change of policy towards China that we have seen in the government?
Yes,
Hard to know, eh?
Yeah, it's hard to know, but also I think that in terms I'm thinking of in terms of the ethnic votes, and the other factor that I think the conservative in particular is looking at is because of the concentration of these communities in urban areas and in GTA, which is not traditionally ridings that they have been making any inroads in. So I think that's why I think the contradiction is going to be playing out more, because you're talking about particularly the recent immigrants and new immigrants are more highly educated, and they're seeing something, they want something more from the government than just being in a photo op. Yeah. But at the same time, we're not seeing any policies that actually address the issue. So we have the cancellation of the long form census, which is going to make this kind of debate harder in a few years' time. Cancellation of funding to immigrant services, we have seen a $43 million cut in the Ontario region for immigrants, and cancellation of the core challenges program. All of these things speak directly opposite to the interests of these communities.
Let me try this with Randall. I think it's fair to say that this conservative government has been probably the most pro-Israeli government in the Western world, certainly in the last 10 years, 20 years, something like that. And the Jewish community has accordingly, given its support much more to the Conservative Party. Do you see that direct relationship with other so-called ethnic communities as well?
Oh, I mean, certainly. I mean, it's complex. I mean, often you'll have a combination of principle and politics and pragmatism. I think Harper is actually genuinely himself committed to the state of Israel. It'd be pretty strange if he were indifferent to the position of Jewish Canadians' votes on this issue. It ties together quite nicely. The case of China, I think, is more interesting because it's running in different directions. I mean, as you're quite right, the conservatives were very critical of China's human rights record, and they got, rather amusingly, a lot of flack from the left for criticizing human rights, which I found worth a chuckle. And now they've tried to reposition that, but they're partly doing it historically. I mean, the apology for the head tax was an effort to try and address concerns of Chinese Canadians. I actually had something to say about Jeff's point on, can we come back to that? Yeah. Because it seems to me this issue of whether he's going to alienate core voters goes to the distinction between political salience and electoral salience. Political salience just means it matters. It's an issue in politics. Electoral salience means they vote in those terms. I don't think conservatives in Alberta vote on the basis of what is said about immigrants. I think what they vote on is economic concerns, tax, maybe decentralization, healthcare. So what the conservatives are wisely trying to do is speak to their base on core electoral issues while reaching out to new immigrants on issues on which that base doesn't vote anyway. So I actually disagree slightly with Jeff that this will pose a problem for them.
Want to come back at that?
No, I was just speaking about the conservative voters who vote because of conservative values, and there certainly are those voters. They're not all the ones that you mentioned, and those are the ones, I think, who are going to be a little puzzled by the appeal to the
yeah, no, I agree, but they've got nowhere to go. I mean, there's no one to the right of the conservatives.
Yeah. At the moment.
At the moment, you said.
At the moment.
No, we could have a new party formed. Yeah, definitely.
Let me try looking at this from a different way, because we've sort of put the telescope on the various political parties at the moment and asked, are they pandering? Are they doing all of that other bad stuff? But I want to look at the communities directly. Is it also fair to say, Quam, starting with you, that there are so-called leaders of these so-called ethnic communities that love having their picture taken in the local community ethnic press with the Prime Minister or with cabinet ministers, and that they actually enjoy the dance? They like being courted, and that far from being offended at what some might perceive as pandering to their communities, they get off on it. Fair to say? I've answered the question. You don't even need to.
I don't know.
Asked and answered.
I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult because there is this sort of strange neo-colonial way of looking at communities, which is the take me to your leader way of looking at communities.
Nice
So you
way to
get a
put it.
political party and you say, oh, take me to your leader and I'll stand next to him and then you'll get your endorsement and everything will be fine. Yeah. And I think that most people are pretty wise to that, and that doesn't work very well. And so I think that there's a problem with the whole structure of thinking of communities that way that we've got to think about.
Avi, you know what I'm talking about here is, whenever anybody wants to run for Parliament, the first thing they tell you is, okay, here's the head of the Filipino community, you got to meet with him. Here's the head of the Chinese community in your neighborhood, you got to meet with him. Here's the head of the Korean Association, you got to meet with him. I mean, these people kind of like their status too, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we call them either the gatekeepers or the godfathers. So and they, some of them do exist, I think, in the community. But I think just taking, somebody mentioned the head tax as an example, and that's an example of how the community came together over a 20-year period of time to lobby a particular resolution that kind of dispel all these myths about gatekeeping, because at the end of the day, it was not those so-called leaders in the community which deliver. It's through community mobilization.
They would say so. They would say they delivered.
Yeah, well, they would. Yeah. It's in their interest to say so.
But would they be wrong?
Well, I think the whole idea that there is a community is part of the problem. I mean, there are lots of different communities. I mean, and then when you get to people talking about the black community, I mean, there are lots of different African, Caribbean cultural groups. And the idea that you can have one gatekeeper to a whole complex culture.
It's offensive in a way.
It's ridiculous. It doesn't work very well.
It's tokenistic and it's oversimplifying the community. But I have to say that sometimes, the media kind of play into it as well. Like, sort of like they will look at, this community, a certain issue happened, and they'll go to this one person to speak about this one issue when, there may be many views on the issue, like, even human rights in China. There are a lot of people in the community who want to see human rights in China, and then they don't necessarily see, pandering to the Chinese government is a good thing. When Dalai Lama was in town, there are lots of people who were there, to see him talk, like, many from our community. So I think it's just the whole idea of how one person or a few people can represent the entire community and then, then can deliver the votes. It's offensive.
It's fair to say that so-called, hyphenated Canadians enjoy being courted by the politicians, right? I mean,
They certainly do, and it makes
not
sense
naive about this.
it makes sense to meet with leaders and all that. And it doesn't mean that 100% of, if you're successful and make a good impression, you're going to get 100% of the vote for a particular candidate. Let's face it, we've been talking about the immigrant vote is always delivered to the Liberals. Well, it's still only like 50% or something like that that goes to that party. So, and the rest are distributed. So there's never unanimity, and it's not only because of different ethnic groups. Within each ethnic group, there's going to be a variety of votes. And so it makes sense, though, still, to use the networks within the community to try to reach some of them. And you'll reach other people in the minority communities by appealing to other organizations in the community that they may be associated with.
Randall, it has seemed as if the Liberals and the Conservatives have been the kind of, that's the big fight for the so-called ethnic vote in the country. Do the Greens, do the New Democrats, do the Bloc Québécois have any inroads to those communities, and do they claim any percentage, regular percentage of those communities?
Well, nothing that the Bloc has done has convinced me that they're terribly interested in the, shall we call it, the ethnic vote. The NDP certainly could make inroads if they appealed to, I mean, again, the fair point has to be made. You need to break this down according to particular issues. And there's no doubt groups of immigrants for whom social policy, economic concerns are prevalent, and then that could speak to core NDP concerns. But for the moment, as you said, it seems to be the Liberals and Conservatives playing this game. One point I would like to add, because it fills out what people have said, is that everyone's absolutely right that the vote is not delivered to a party, and indeed in Canada, comparatively, there's much less of a left-wing bias than I than there is in other countries. So in Germany, about 90% of Turks vote for the Social Democrats. Sometimes over 85% of the Afro-British community votes for the Labour Party. What you're seeing in Canada is a much more differentiated picture, which is interesting.
Do you have any idea whether African Canadians, if I can put it that way, what's the right expression to use?
I'm not an African Canadian.
People who have dark skin in this community,
So there are
do we
people
know
of
who they vote
African
for?
origin.
They're from African origin, they're from Caribbean origin.
There are people who say they're members of racialized groups. There are
Right.
loads of different phrases.
Do they typically deliver a vast majority of their votes to one party? Does anybody know?
I don't know.
As I say, it's not, they disproportionately vote for the Liberals, but not more than 50%. And the rest
That's
are
the way it
the-
has been. Is it still that way?
Yeah.
It is still that
well,
way.
I looked at some data in November, from November, and it was like that.
But
So,
what happened with the vote for mayor?
which?
For mayor. The vote for mayor.
Mayor.
Mayor of Toronto.
Yeah.
Well, those aren't parties, though, right?
No,
so
I
we're not looking at
understand,
Liberals and Conservatives.
but you know, Rob Ford managed to get a
a lot
reasonable
of immigrant
vote.
vote,
of-
despite being, some people thought he was anti-immigrant.
yeah, because of the issues.
Yeah.
Let me
That's
try
right.
this. Avi, to you first on this. You'll remember this. The Lucky Moose Food Mart. It has become one of those real flashpoints in Canadian political history right now. Its owner was charged when he tried to thwart a serial shoplifter, and there was a great deal of public outcry on his behalf. Jason Kenney has done photo ops with him. David Chen is his name. He's often talked about his plight. If you go by that store today, you will see a sign for Olivia Chow, the NDP candidate, in his window. Is this a case of blood being thicker than water?
Well, Olivia, well, as far as I can tell, Olivia has also been, supportive of Mr. Chen. I have my own view about the whole issue, but certainly it's not just Mr. Kenney who's been there. Both the NDP and the Conservative were very much active on that file. I believe NDP was the one who introduced a bill.
Private members bill, yes.
Private members bill first. And certainly, of course, Olivia has been MP in that riding for many years, so I'm sure that
But the Conservatives made him the star of their law and order campaign, right? And
Yes,
they
and-
certainly would have anticipated.
Right, and
getting his
and
vote.
to what extent that has swayed Mr. Chen one way or another? I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I saw him in the media talking about, I'm not sure who I'm going to vote, and and he was standing right in front of Olivia's side when he said that. But that's the other thing too. Like even if some people came out to the photo op, and because the Prime Minister is there. Does that necessarily mean that they're going to vote for him? Because I think sometimes that's the only way for marginalized communities to have access to power. So they take whatever opportunity they can get. If that means that, standing behind Mr. Harper as a prop, they will do it.
Tell me this, there's, I don't know, 5 or 6 Chinatowns in the Greater Toronto Area? Do you have any idea whether they vote in a preponderant way for one party over another?
No, I don't think anyone would know. I mean, maybe the social scientists would know. I personally doesn't know.
Yeah, well, they do.
Do they?
They
For
tend to
whom?
vote for a Liberal.
They do.
Yeah.
Still.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. For sure. Now, I don't know about, we raised the question of the children of immigrants, and I haven't seen any data on how they vote. My prediction, though, would be that their social values and many of the issues that concern them move toward the mainstream, so that you would see much less ethnic voting in this children of immigrants, second generation, than for their parents. That would be my
It's
guess.
very interesting to see because some of the research on health, of course, shows that the children of the second generation children sometimes have more problems
Yes.
with social mobility, more problems with racism than others. And so it may be that
I would agree with that, and I think you'd see a shift away from the so-called cultural issues that are preoccupying people about the immigrant generation, and more toward issues of discrimination, which are more on the minds of the children of non-European immigrants. Yeah, for sure.
I have heard it said by so-called leaders in the Jewish community that you got to go out and vote for Stephen Harper. He's been the most pro-Israel prime minister we've ever had. You got to go vote for him. He's entitled to your vote. They don't make the pitch on the basis of what he's done on tax policy or what he's done on immigration policy or what he's done on health or education or anything else. He's been good to Israel, and therefore he deserves the Jewish community's vote. How do you find that kind of appeal? How would you regard it?
Well, I mean, it's been in any major settler country, of which Canada is obviously one. If we look at American history, as A, appealing to an ethnic vote has been very common, and B, you'll appeal to the issue that it seems to be salient. And at the moment, in a situation in which Israel seems increasingly isolated internationally, that's an issue that matters to many Jewish Canadians.
I don't mean
so
to
that, sorry, I may have misunderstood your
Yeah.
question. No, please, go ahead.
No, I'm obviously not trying to pick on the Jewish community by saying this,
Yeah.
but it's basically saying, don't worry about domestic policy when you're voting for your, when you mark your X on the 2nd of May. Foreign policy and this one particular issue within foreign policy ought to be all you ought to be concerned about.
Yeah, but I think in any democratic context, it's not up to us to give a hierarchy of issues to tell people what they should be concerned about. So if the issue happens to be foreign rather than domestic, I mean, so be it. For many Muslim Canadians, it might be that Afghanistan is the issue.
Okay, Quinn?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. We can look at it as foreign policy, or we can look at it as identity. And if we look at it as identity, identity is very important in Israel. And what happens to Israel is important with regards to identity. But we do have people who are Greens or whomever who are looking globally as opposed to just locally. And people will vote for those reasons. And I don't necessarily have a problem with it. People will vote as they want to.
Well, I wonder, Jeff. Go ahead,
These
Jeff.
appeals don't always work.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the Republicans in the United States went for the Hispanic vote. Now they get the Cuban vote. They don't get the Mexican vote. And, they try. They went with their best arguments, which had to do with the idea that they were going to make a path to citizenship for Mexicans who were undocumented in the United States, and that was going to be popular. But the Mexican community wasn't really interested in the Bush proposals, and they didn't get many. The Republicans hasn't gotten very many of their votes.
And George W. Bush was offside for most of his party on this. He said, we've got to start appealing to those Hispanic voters.
Yeah.
And they didn't listen to him.
No, and,
Yeah.
I mean, the basic problem is that the message hasn't been nuanced enough to make people comfortable with it. And, once it becomes more nuanced, then people might be more interested. But as it is, it could put people off. Unless that's the strategy. The strategy could be to put people off so that 20% of the population don't vote.
Well, we know vote suppression is a legitimate, well, I shouldn't say legitimate, but we know the parties do it.
Yeah.
We do. Okay, about a minute to go here. Avi, let me try this with you. How long does it take for a voter in this country who's a so-called hyphenated Canadian to feel more like the word on the right-hand side of the hyphen than on the left-hand side of the hyphen when they vote?
I think when media as well as politicians stop using phrase like ethnic votes or getting the very ethnic votes, then the sooner it will be for, and I would say, the people of color, because we're not talking about the French and English here. And even you talk about the Jewish Canadian community, when the issue of Israel is raised, nobody will say, well, Jewish Canadian community is concerned about people, outside of Canada. But if it's another community, someone from the Arab community or Chinese community, then it's like, well, you haven't integrated enough. I think there is a double standard here somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, lots of people have said that. I mean, he just said it about the Jewish community. Lots
Yeah,
of
but
people
that's
raise
not a
exactly that
common-
issue.
That's not a common view.
Well,
There can't be any problem with people having a number of different cultures and thinking about the policies as they come up and the issues as they come up, depending on their complex
The only problem I got
cultures.
is with the clock because it's just run out.
Yeah.
Quinn McKenzie from CAMH and Randall Hansen from the University of Toronto. Thanks for being there on one side of the table. Avi Go and Jeffrey Wrights, also from the University of Toronto, on the other side of the table. Thanks so much, everybody.